So, Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, and it is the word for law. Okay, so the Bible is comprised. Well, the Pentateuch is another name for the Torah. Okay, so Pentateuch, Pent means 5, and so Pentateuch is a reference to the 5 books. Okay, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So, and that is also referred to as the Torah, which is the law. So it was the law of Moses. So anyway, so we'll get into this later, but the Hebrew Bible is referred to as the Tanakh, which actually is TNK. That's an acronym really for the 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible, which is the Torah. And then there's 2 other things that I'd have to look at how to pronounce them. But the one begins with N and the other begins with K. And so, and those reference other sections of the Old Testament. So the Old Testament, the original Old Testament, the likes of First and Second Chronicles was 1 book. First, Second Kings were 1 book, and First, Second Samuel, I think, were 1 book at one point. So, but our English Bible split them, so we have 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. So, right. So what we're just continuing on with Numbers here, and so basically what's been going on in the book of Numbers is that the Israelites have up to this point spent about a year going through the Red Sea, getting to Mount Sinai, and it was at the foot of Mount Sinai that they then received the law. They received the 10 Commandments. They then Moses gets all the plans for the tabernacle. And so all those things are formulated, put into place. There's challenges to that. There's the whole situation with the golden calf and all that carry on. And then Leviticus was basically God establishing the Levitical law. And so that was all the sacrificial system, the feasts, all the other various sorts of rules and regulations, which then totaled up to 613. So there's not just 10 commandments, there's 613 of them. So so Numbers then is getting back to a kind of an historical footing, because it's in the beginning of Numbers that we then have God taking a census of all the tribes, and God told them, okay, I want you to put these tribes in this position. So the likes of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun were on the east side, and then the other tribes were positioned around the edge of the tabernacle. The tabernacle sat in the middle, and but the tribe of Levi was immediately around the middle, and so Moses and Aaron and their families, they were on the side where the entrance of the tabernacle was, and then the other Levitical families then sat around that, and they had the responsibilities of either carrying the furniture, carrying the soft furnishings, meaning the drapes and all the curtains and all that stuff, and then there was the family that carried the hardware. Okay, that the stuff that the boards and poles and things. So everything was very, very well structured, and the reason that there was this structure was because God was going to go, let's get up and move. All right. So we're embarking on this time to move, because God doesn't want you to stay in the wilderness. He doesn't want you just to be finding it comfortable wherever you are. So because unfortunately there's a lot of people that find it comfortable just to be in the same old, and it's all predictable and all that kind of thing. So, but the journey to going elsewhere can be fraught with a lot of challenge and so on. So basically in Numbers 10, we have this going on. So Numbers 10, 11 through 13 says, now it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month in the second year. Okay, so this is, we're now into the second month. So that we're basically embarking into what, the 14th month, okay, after they left Egypt. So that the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle of the testimony, and the children of Israel set out from the wilderness of Sinai on their journeys, and then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So they settled or started out for the first time according to the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses. So basically, the preparations for departure then took over a year, which included how you lay out your camp, laws about holy living, sacrificial system, procedures, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so God is about procedure, God is about preparation. So because the Israelites were coming out of a system that was just, not good at all. They were coming out of Egypt, which was bondage and all those sorts of things. And so things needed to be structured for them. It was very, very new for them to enter into a place where they can worship God and please God as God designs. And the purpose really is to progress, develop, mature spiritually in terms of trust, holiness, and wisdom that is rooted in a covenant relationship with the Lord. And the whole thing about this travel, as we've seen in past studies, is that when the glory of God by the pillar of cloud lifted up and moved, then everybody packed up, okay? But it was so designed that basically the tabernacle could be taken down in a half an hour. So everybody knew their job. Everybody knew exactly what to do. It wasn't the kind of thing that took a couple of weeks to pack up and checklists and, all this kind of, they didn't go through that, but like, when I set up for this in the morning time, this takes me maybe about 5 minutes now, whereas before, I was trying to figure out how to get all this together and make it work, So, and you don't need to do that type of thing every time, that you do hone the procedure down, and that's what God did, is God gave them the right procedure so that when they went, then they weren't belabored with all a pile of, well, how do we do this? How do we, we better get our book out and read this. We will get to that. I think it was somewhere between 30 and 40 times. So now at the end of Numbers, there is a summary of their moves, and so it talks about every time they move. So now that summary does include the camps when they went from Egypt to Sinai. So now the tabernacle wasn't in place at that particular point, but there was different places like Pi-Haroth, Mara, Elam, different bits and pieces. And then when they got to Sinai, that's when they sort of got all this established. And then there was a whole bunch of stopping points after that. Now, God is taking them to the wilderness of Paran, which is near Kadesh Barnea, which is right on the south end of the Promised Land. And we'll look at that today because, God then sends the 12 spies to go up and check this out. Now, this was an 11-day march. That's it. Only took 11 days. But because of what happens in the wilderness of Paran in terms of what the 12 spies report and what they all decide to do, that went from 11 days to 40 years. So, but anyway, God has all these things structured for our good. So now there's challenges then to this move, okay? And one of the main challenges that seems to be peppered through this entire book is complaints. People complain, people gurn, people just get on silly, and they're like, see this and see you, and pointing fingers, and you know. So you had sort of general complaints that took place, you know, where people were just generally moany, okay, and they're just being a wee moan, and just, you know, we don't have enough water, you know, we don't like our food, we don't, you know, and now God's wrath then burned up some of the people on the edge of the camp, and so Moses interceded for them, and in regard to that. They gurned about the provision of manna because they were like, all we have is this manna and it's cat. We don't like it. So we want to go back to Egypt because we like the food that's in Egypt. So they talked about fish. They talked about cucumbers. They talked about melons. They talked about leeks, garlics, and onions. So all kinds of vegetables of various sorts. However, when you think about the nutritional value of those particular things, most of those are condiments, you know, and very little nutritional value, some medicinal value. But if you made a diet of onions and leeks and cucumbers and melons, you die, you know, because you know, the likes of cucumbers and melons really have very, very little goodness in them. It's just mostly water, very, very even little fiber in them, you know. So but the people were wanting these things. Why? Because they were tasty. You know, it was good in their estimation, but God provided for them manna, which may have not been, well, actually tasted like coriander mixed with something else, and it was kind of wafery sort of things. But they could grind it, they could pound it, they could bake it, they could fry it, they could, you know, do all sorts of things with it, and it was a perfectly nutritionally balanced meal. So now God's design was not for them to have manna for the rest of their lives. The manna was the provision for them while they were in the wilderness, and when they got to the promised land, the manna was stopped, because then they were growing their own food. So but now, and Moses also doubted God's wisdom in calling him to leadership because of all these complaints and people, you know, giving him gyp, and he desires to die. You know, now I can understand this, but God was, you know, always seeking to build up Moses in the right way. And but there is always and there is always challenges to leadership, you know, from various fronts, whether it's internal or external. Now, because of Moses kind of giving off about, I don't have any help, what God does is he provides leadership then through 70 elders. He says to Moses, go and find 70 men. Now, they were exercising responsibility to some extent anyway, because they were, well, they were elders, you know, they were officers within the camp. So they, you know, they were doing things. Now, they were spiritually equipped by God as Moses was, but there is a little caveat with this, and that is Moses was spiritually enabled by God, and what God said was, I will give the portion of the Spirit that is on you, and I will then give it to them. But the problem is that if you take an amount for one person, and then you take that same amount and you place it on 70 people, it's spread out. So these men only had 1/70th of Moses' spirituality. So now, as a result, these men did prophesy, but for a very limited period of time, because their spiritual longevity was actually very short-lived. So they prophesied, meaning that they spoke the word of God, but it only lasted a handful of days.
That's because they had 27 people.
Yeah, yes, because spiritually they had no depth, really. So now the comment that's made by J. Vernon McGee is that the 70 elders here, that eventually morphed into the Sanhedrin, who were 70 men, who then put Christ to death. So that these men probably thought, "Oh boy, I'm getting some importance here," and see Moses getting on the way he's doing. I want some of that action as well. So sometimes God will answer your prayer. Sometimes we go to God and we say, "God, I need this. I want this." And then we kind of beg God nearly. It's like, God, I think this is what is right for me. And we sort of demand with God what we think is right. And God goes, right, you think that's right? Fine. You take it. We'll see. God stands back and watches it all fall down. So as they say, be careful what you ask for because you might get it. So we need, Moses was a spiritually in touch man. He was regarded in these chapters as the man who was most meek. He was most humble, because the other people that were around him weren't. Now, there was the provision of quail too. Now, the other thing that the Israelites were gurning about was the fact that they had no meat. Now, I actually don't get this entirely because they did have flocks. Okay, so they had animals, but they were wanting something that was more maybe reminiscent of what was in Egypt and that kind of thing, because they had their fish and all that stuff. And so God then goes, right, guys, if you want meat, I'll give you meat, but it ain't going to be for a day, nor is it going to be for 2 days or a week. It's going to be for a whole month. And in fact, you're going to have so much of this stuff, it is going to be coming out of your nose. That's what God says. It's going to come out of your nostrils. So he then brings quail. Now a quail is a wee fat bird, about like this big, and probably enough for a little dinner. Okay. But they came in, huge amounts of quail to the point where it was 3 feet deep with quail. So they were eating quail and eating quail and eating quail. And, and God was going, you want your meat? You don't like what my provision is for you? Well, okay, you can have this. And there you go. Aren't you happy now? So there was a lot of stuff going on that just was not great. So a lot of challenges to the move. And then lastly here, there was the leadership challenge from Aaron and Miriam. Now, Aaron and Miriam are the older siblings to Moses. Okay, if you remember, Miriam was the one who, at the instigation of Moses' parents, put Moses in the basket in the Nile River, and she followed the basket and made sure that it got to Pharaoh's daughter. And then when Pharaoh's daughter says, who am I going to get to nurse this child? Then, Miriam pops up out of the bushes and says, hey, I know somebody who can feed the child, and then goes and gets Moses' mom, so she was very much on the early days of God's provision and how things went. But she and Aaron start, maybe out of jealousy, I don't know, start giving off about how Moses is getting on with his leadership. God then tells Aaron, Moses, and Miriam to come down to the tabernacle, and he would have words with them. And Miriam ended up getting leprosy as a result of a judgment, and so then Moses interceded for her, and so on. So, and it's interesting that Aaron does die along the way somewhere, and because really God's first choice in leadership was Moses, not Aaron. So Aaron was raised up as an answer to Moses, quote, not being able to talk. So because Moses' complaint against God was, I can't speak, I'm no good at this. And then God says, well, who made man's mouth? I've done this, you can do this. And then Moses continues on in that complaint. And then God says, right, we have Aaron, your brother here. He's a good speaker. So, okay, we'll use him. But really, that's not God's, primary answer. So it's because Moses keeps on pushing this agenda of I'm not good. I can't feed into God's agenda. So, but eventually Aaron, and Aaron wasn't really a great winner, even though he was the high priest. He had kids that botched it, and then ended up buying the farm in the tabernacle in chapter, what was it, 9 or 10 of Leviticus, chapter 10, because they offered profane fire to God. Shouldn't have been doing that. Well, Aaron was the guy that should have been instructing them to get them sorted out that way. And and then of course Aaron was the one who came up with golden calf escapade. Happy days. Okay, so now we then get on to the whole 12 spies thing. Okay, so this is chapter 13 and 14 of Numbers. And so this is the bits that I want to sort of sit with a bit here, because this is where things really kind of grind to a halt. But we'll look at these verses initially here. So let's look at Numbers 13, 1-2 initially. And it says, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers, you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. And then God does list the leaders of those particular tribes, two of which we know well. One of them is Joshua, who comes from the tribe of Ephraim. And then we also have Caleb, who is from the tribe of Judah. So the other men are the other 10. Okay. So there's 12 men being sent up. But what I want you to notice in this particular statement that God makes to Moses is God is the one that says send spies. Okay. So this is not some sort of, God's not saying, there's the land, go to it. Trust me. He says, no, go send spies. So this is something that God says. But how he ends this statement, though, is he says, which I am giving to the children of Israel. So God is giving this land to the Israelites. So there's a reason why there's spies being sent up, but the end result really is this is the land I'm giving you. Okay, so I'm not telling you to go up there and make some sort of an assessment and go, ooh, boy, this is a bit tough. No, God, I think you got this wrong, so we'll just backpedal out of this. God is not giving them that kind of option. All right. So now later on in the chapter, down to verse 17 and 20 of chapter 13, it says, then Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up this way into the south and up to the mountains and see what the land is like, whether the people who dwell in it are weak or strong or weak, few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are forests there or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. Now, when they went up into the land, they did get a whole cluster of grapes from the valley of Eshcol, and Eshcol just means cluster, and the cluster of grapes was so huge that they had to carry it between two men. So if you can, you go down to Tesco's and you get a little cluster of grapes, it's say about 15 on the little cluster or something like that. This cluster of grapes was, they had a pole, to hold this thing. And so if me and Sam are walking, and there's about 5 to 6 feet worth of grapes all hanging, and we're and it's a big thing. So this is the land flowing with milk and honey. This is a great place. So there's great, this will make the manna look silly. Okay. But this is the instruction of God, and Moses then sets out the parameters as to what to do. So, and we'll just look at some notes about those particular paragraphs, and need to ask the question, well, what is the land a picture of? Okay, because sometimes we have the idea about what this is, and most of the times our notions about it are wrong. Okay, so the land is not heaven. Okay, it is not a representation of heaven. Now, we have a lot of hymns that sort of lend itself to that, because we talk about going on the other side of the river. Okay. So we think that going on the other side of the Jordan is something like, going into heaven. Now, that's not right. And the reason for that is because if heaven is a place where there is battle, that doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. So because heaven is the place of the abode of God, there is no battle there. There is no sin there. There's no problem there. So, but what the land is it represents maturity. Okay, it represents going into the place of blessing, going into the place that God wants you to be, the place where there is growth. So the wilderness is a training ground. There is hardship there, but there is hardship in the land as well. There's enemies to be attacked. There's enemies to be dealt with. And sometimes we can't deal with those enemies until we're prepared to do it. So really what the land of Canaan is a picture of being mature. So now these 12 men that were sent up as spies, they were to go up and do an assessment. Okay, they were to find out whether the land was rich or poor, the people were strong or weak, strongholds, little towns, what was the crack up there? Okay, and the reason this was necessary was because these people had no experience of this place in living memory. Okay, remember they were down in Egypt for 400 years, so Canaan's changed. So now that's where the people of God originally came from, but things have changed. So, but the assessment was in the light of God's direction and instruction in the way forward. So, so the whole purpose really of going there was not to see whether we can do this or not. It was to be informed about what it is. So it's always good to figure out, what you're dealing with. So because sometimes people just go in blind, and not have a notion of what's going on. So and unfortunately, I've seen a lot of Christian workers go into various sorts of fields very, very unprepared. I think they're prepared sort of somewhat in spiritual terms, like, okay, God, we believe you want us to do this. Okay, that's fine. But when you get into that particular part of the world, there is some very practical things that you need to understand. You need to understand language. You need to understand culture. You need to understand money. You need to understand how the utilities work. You need to understand what side of the road to drive on. All that kind of stuff. So and see what the world is like. So, because I remember, this might sound like a silly thing, but when I was in America, because Americans have their various sorts of ideas about things, and basically Americans think their idea is the only idea. And so when I got application forms from Ireland Outreach down in Dublin sent to me over in Baltimore, they came on A4 size pieces of paper. I looked at the A4 size piece of paper and then I compared it with our standard size of paper, which is 8.5 by 11 inches. Similar size, but my paper, American paper, 8.5 by 11, is slightly wider and slightly shorter. So I looked at the paper and I went, what on earth are they doing? They must have gotten some sort of custom-made paper to go in a strange size of an envelope to set. Why aren't they using 8.5 by 11? That's stupid. Yeah, that was my attitude. And so I remember thinking to myself, here I am, I'm going to apply for a position to work with computers and things like this. Those people over in Ireland don't know what they're doing. We got to make sure that they have 8.5 by 11 paper. And they're using this strange, Now, when I got over here, guess what I found out? The stuff that they use here is standard. Okay, so my standard wasn't their standard. But so I learned very quickly what that particular standard was, and plus you have these, bizarre plugs. Here, let me show you how. See that 3-pronged thing? I mean, that is massive. That is so desperately huge, and most people in the known world would agree with this, that a 13 amp plug is massive. Now we have smaller things over in America. That's because our voltage is less. We have 110 volts, it's 240 volts over here. And again, I'm looking at some of this stuff going, this is crazy. Why do people use these things? But if I tried to take an American plug and stick it in a socket here, it wouldn't work. Because there's different standards here. So anyway, the people, they need to go out and find out what's going on. So, and what life is like up there. So, cameras. Right. Now, this land belongs to the people of God and can be taken via trust in the Lord. Okay, so this is not land that belongs to somebody else. This land belongs to the people of God. Okay, now let's look at the report then that the men give when they come back. Okay, Numbers 13:26 to 29. So it says, now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. So they brought back this big cluster of grapes, big, serious thing. Left people in no doubt, this is great stuff. Never seen the like of it. Verse 27, and then they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us, and it truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And the Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. So they did make a very comprehensive sweep of the land. They were there for 40 days. So they're talking about the Amalekites, which are in the south. Now, they've had problems with the Amalekites before in chapter 17 of Exodus. And that was the situation where Moses was sitting on top of the rock, up on top of the hill. And as long as his hands were raised, Joshua and the Israelites prevailed against the Amalekites. But when Moses' hands were dropped, then the Amalekites were starting to win. And so then Aaron and another man called Hur came in, put a rock underneath Moses so he could sit. And then they hold his hands up, and they defeated the Amalekites. So, but the Amalekites are known as not great people to, work with. So they're in the south. So they're going to be sort of the first sort of people that you're going to be dealing with. Then the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains. So the Jebusites would have been in the position of where Jerusalem would be. Okay, so Jerusalem was only a little village at this particular stage, but that's where the Jebusites were mainly at that particular point. The Hittites were farther up into Lebanon and going into sort of modern day Turkey. Okay, up in into Syria and that that sort of part of the world. The Amorites, again, in mountainous areas that were more sort of east of where the Jebusites were, in Jerusalem, sort of tucked in there between that and the Jordan River. And then it says the Canaanites, well, they were up by the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and they were also along the banks of the Jordan. So they were covering a pretty comprehensive, sizable area. Now, in terms of size, we're not talking about much of a different. I would say they probably traveled maybe 150 to 200 miles north of their particular position. So not terribly far. I'm talking about, from say Coleraine down to Dublin, that sort of a distance. So it's not huge. And then the distance between the sea and the Jordan River, really, about 50 miles, something like that. So, it's not a huge thing, really. So, but they do make some reports here about the people, and that they're strong, there's fortified cities and so on and so forth. So now, then there is the perspective that they give, okay? And this is getting on toward the end of this chapter. It says, then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. So this is Caleb's perspective, okay? Now, Caleb is from the tribe of Judah, okay? The Lord Jesus Christ comes from the tribe of Judah. So to me, this is a godly perspective. It says in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, looking unto Jesus, who is the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, was sat down at the right hand of God. Okay, so Caleb was one of these men that saw beyond things. He didn't see just what was sitting in front of him. And so he says, "Come on, let's go. Let's take possession. God has told us this is our land. So what's the problem?" But okay, verse 31, the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we are like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." So there's some very exaggerated sort of language that's used here, because when they talk about all the people whom we saw in it were of great stature. Well, that's not true. Okay, not some were, but not everybody. Okay, so, Goliath was a giant. He came from Gath. His family were pretty big people too, and they were big. They were pushing 10 feet tall. So if you saw Goliath walk into this room, his head would be through the ceiling of it. So now some people would say, "Oh no, that can't happen. That doesn't." The tallest man that ever lived was Robert Willow or whatever, Wilder or whatever his name was, and he was 8'11". He was a seriously tall man, and he didn't live very long. But I think in the Guinness Book of World Records, he died at age 27 or something. But anyway, and at the age of 5, he was 6 foot. So there are big people in this day and age. There's some large guys, but back then there was a whole slaughter of them. Okay, so but sometimes when you see one big thing or a couple of big things, you go, they're everywhere. So that's exaggeration. And then how do they look at themselves? They look at themselves and say, we're like grasshoppers. And then it says, we are like grasshoppers in our own sight. I mean, is that how you see yourself, as a grasshopper? This little thing goes, and then so are we in their sight. So we're definitely grasshopper. So it's either exaggerated, or magnified in some way, or it's very much understated. So let's look at, because there's obviously two different sorts of perspectives that are going on here. So look at some things here. Caleb, and we know from later on, it's Joshua as well. Okay, so Caleb and Joshua's perspective was based on God's promise of taking them into the land. So at the beginning of chapter 13, where God says, send spies into the land I'm giving you, they went, absolutely. That's what God says. So that's what we're going to do. So that was their perspective, and it was based on God's promise. Okay. Now, the other 10 men's perspective was based on comparisons of their strength, apart from God, to the enemy in the land, and they saw impossibilities and barriers. So that was the main thing that they saw, and they just says, no, can't do it. And that's because they're not spiritually in touch with who God is. I mean, it does baffle you, because these men would have seen God part the Red Sea, drown all the whole army of the Egyptians and all that stuff, seen the pillar of cloud, seen the pillar of fire, seen what went on in terms of God's judgment to various sorts of individuals, in terms of the golden calf situation, when people were complaining, what happened there, lots of things where God was expressly demonstrating his strength and power, and grace and mercy, I must say, but yet they go and look at this thing and say, gosh, did you see the big people up there? Gosh, they're everywhere. I mean, they're huge, they're big, and they're massive. And it's just like, no, we're not going there. So, yeah, completely. So, but Caleb and Joshua, they see things differently. So, so the question that I have here is, how do we see life and challenges? Do we see them just as these other 10 men did, which was their impossibilities, their walls, their barriers, there's blockages, I can't do this, I don't have the strength, and so on and so forth. We build all those things up and just say, no can do. Or do we adopt a perspective of Caleb and Joshua, says, well, that's what God says that we'll do, so that's what's going to happen. We just have to trust God to do that. So now, it isn't easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but God does give away. So, so do we give up and go back? And let me tell you, there's no blessing in going backwards. None. I sit with people sometimes and who have progressed to a certain extent. They've made decisions in the Lord and they see the blessing of God taking them forward. And then something gets a bit tight, something gets a bit hard, and then they go, no, can't cope. I'm going to go back to Egypt. Okay, well, if you think that going back there is going to be okay, you have something else to think about. So God does not bring people part way and then fail. So now all of us have our journey. All of us have our things that we're dealing with. And, you know, there's family things, there's work things, there's housing things, there's addiction things, there's medical things, there's all kinds of stuff, you know, and, you know, believe you me, I know about some of these things. I don't know about all of them, but I do know the stuff that's going on in my life and the times where I've been very tempted to give up. But I thank God that God helped me to see, no, if you keep on going, I will be with you, I will help you, and we'll get there. So, but there is a great temptation just to go and jack it in. So, but this is where you go and hang on to the promise of God, which says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He who has begun a good work in you will complete it. You know, those are great promises. Those are great things that you hang on to. One thing I like about teaching the Bible is that I don't have to invent anything. I don't actually have to come up with any, I don't have to say, well, there's the 10 steps of this, and then there's the 15 procedures of whatever. All the people that do lectures and seminars on stuff that happens in the earth about, they have to sit down and have to conjure up things and figure stuff out and all that. I don't have to do that because the God has it. I don't have to invent things. So it makes it a little bit easier. So again, question is, what is your challenge? You can't change your circumstances, but you can change your perspective. Because you see the giants of the land and all them people and all that situation up in the thing, the only difference there was perspective. It wasn't the circumstance. The situation up there was the same regardless of what side of the fence you were sitting on. So, but there is people out there that want to just sit and believe that it doesn't exist. And that's not very helpful. And again, I sit with people who are dealing with life's challenges, and they actually pretend that they don't exist because they don't want to deal with it. So if they can park it in their head somewhere and just go, no, I don't believe that actually is, or whatever, then they don't have to go there with it. Then they sit in their own little world, thinking something that's not true. So, but you're not going to be progressing. You're not going to be going anywhere because what you're believing is untrue. Now, how does this all finish up here? There's then the decision of the people. Okay, so we've looked at the report, we've looked at the perspective, and now we're looking at what they're going to do. So this is in the beginning of chapter 14. And it says this, and it says, all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness, why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not been better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. And this is democracy in force here, because it's 10 against 2. So the majority of the men go, we can't do this. Here God's. It would have been just better for us to stay in Egypt. It would have been better. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. They did not know who God was. Yeah. So, because you would have had, see those 70 men from earlier, they saw God and all these things, and yet their spiritual perspective was next to nothing. So, and back in the days too, when Jethro came to Moses, and that was Moses' father-in-law, he comes up to Moses and says, Moses, you're really wearing yourself out here, bud, because you're exercising, judgment or being a judge for the people all day long, and you're getting tired, and so let's get some men. Well, that wasn't God's plan, really. God's plan was to use Moses. Now, if God would then said, let's get men together and do this, that's fine. But this was Jethro's idea. Jethro was I would say he was a believer in God, but he wasn't he wasn't an Israelite. Okay. And the other problem too with the people that are part of this going up from Mount Sinai to the wilderness of Paran is not only do you have Israelites, but you do have a contingent of Egyptians, and not to sound sort of racist, but half-bred people. Okay, so Israelites that would have intermarried with Egyptians, and so you had sort of half Egyptian, half Israelite people. So, and I think the lesson there is sometimes you stand in the world with one foot, and then you stand in spiritual things with the other foot, and then you're trying to figure out where to go and how to be. And you're pulled in two different directions. And so, and the Bible talks about the mixed multitude. And so you have the Israelites going up in their tribes, and then at the very, very end, you have the mixed multitude. You have these stragglers and these people that are bringing up the back end, but they really don't want to go there. They're all going back to looking at Egypt going, why in the heck did we go with these people? We thought it was going to be good crack and all this kind of stuff. And, but yeah, so, so sometimes in your assessment of your life, you have to go and look at, is there stragglers within myself? Because sometimes there's appetites and things within us that go, I'm not sure if I really want to run with God here. I just want to go and go back to old things and go back to old life and do them things, And when you have that, then you're torn betwixt and between. I remember when I used to work at camp, one of my jobs, we would have taken the campers up what was called Mount Ampersand, which was in upstate New York, where the camp was in the Adirondack Mountains, absolutely beautiful part of the world. And so we would take the 300 campers up this trail, which was miles long, up to the top of Mount Ampersand, and it was a great view and all this kind of stuff. And then we had lunch for them and so on, and then we brought them back down. But I was part of the group that actually brought up the rear. And I tell you, see some of these campers that didn't want to walk. Some of these girls were like, so hard. And of course, you couldn't go in front of them and say, come on. You actually had to stand behind them. I tell you, watching the back ends of these girls was not much fun, because they were just all whipsy wopsy and kind of shuffling about, And so I'm going to give Margaret her death here. So So you have so I want to encourage you just to look within yourself and say what is the rear end that I'm trying to bring up here, in terms of what's the stragglers, what are those physical things, what are those spiritual things, what are those psychological things that we have in our heads and our bodies that we're just struggling to bring along because they really don't want to, so now the next paragraph here, it says, then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of Israel. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. And then finally it says, and all the congregation said to stone them with stones. And now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. I think that's awful sad.
And Joshua and Caleb.
Yep. Yeah. And here they give this real rah message.
This book of God's behalf.
Yeah. Because Joshua and Caleb are going, what we've passed through is great. It's good land. But they give the caveat here, they give the condition, if the Lord delights us, then he will bring us into the land, give it to us. But don't rebel against God. Don't do this. Don't go down this road. Or fear the people. They're our bread, their protection's gone. Lord's with us. Don't fear them. So And I think when Joshua and Caleb eventually went into the land, because these are the only two men that actually made it, everybody else, that generation of people didn't make it. Their kids did, but they didn't. I'm sure that they reflected back on this day and they say, you know what, we still believe this, and we're going to go in and we're going to take it. But they had to make sure that they got it right, though, because as we've seen with the studies in Joshua, with the pastor there last number of weeks, there was times where Joshua and the people got it wrong, especially with Ai. But then when they got it right, bang, it was in there. But all the congregation said to stone them with stones. And it's interesting, when you go through these chapters, it talks about the glory of the Lord appearing in the tabernacle. Pretty much every time there's a complaint. So God is there. God hasn't up sticks here and gone, you know what, see you people, stuff it, I'm going away. God remains. God hangs in there because these are his people. He's not going to leave them. So, but he is going to judge them. So, and again, I sit with situations where people are looking at their lives and they're going, God has brought us this far, but we can't cope and we're going to shut down. And I tell you, I give stark warnings and I say, if you do that, there will be no blessing of God there. None. So it's very, very important, if we're convinced in the Lord of a way forward that we have, hang in there, because that's the right thing to do. So that is that.